So on today's episode of Believing in God, I've got a good friend of mine called Tim, who I met a few weeks ago at my church, and I'm just going to be asking him a few questions based on his faith and how he became a Christian and what his life was before he became a Christian. And so thank you, Tim, for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem. So can you give the listeners and me a bit of a background of what your life was like before you became a Christian?
Certainly can. I grew up in a Christian home, but I wasn't a Christian, and I kind of took it all for granted. My father was actually the minister of a church, and to me it was all a bit tedious because we were always having to go off to church and be there on time, and the whole of Sundays in particular were dominated by the meetings that my father had to run. So anyway, I just didn't really think that much of it growing up. And big thing I wanted to do was be in a rock band. I had a couple of friends, very good friends, and we formed this band, and we used to practice like 3 nights a week. We just dreamed of being, rock stars. The problem was that we were trying to be rock stars at the point that John Travolta and Saturday Night Fever broke in. Nobody wanted to listen to a rock band. They all wanted disco. So it wasn't the best of times to launch a band. And in the meantime, I was also at school and doing GCSEs, O-levels as they were, because it was a long time ago. And there were some young people who had come back from university to a church that we went to. And there was something about particularly one of them that was just really different. It's hard to put this in words, but it's like, there was something in this lady's eyes, just was like sparkling life. It's the only way I can put it. It wasn't any kind of attraction between us, anything like that. There was just something about her particularly that was really different. And this kind of bugged me because I'd not really seen that in the members of the church. And so by various ways, I started joining in with a youth group they set up. And I very quickly demonstrated that I really didn't know very much about following Jesus at all, despite having been brought up in this kind of home atmosphere. And then I started to listen to people a bit more and try and learn. And to cut a long story short, there was a particular period I'd done my O-levels. It was the summer, and I was just crashing out. But I was crashing out and asking questions at the same time. And I happened to get hold of a couple of books. One of them was Run Baby Run by Nicky Cruz.
Okay.
And the other one was a well-known one called Prison to Praise. I read both of these books and God started speaking to me, and things happened.
So because you mentioned about, you being brought up in a strict Christian home where you had to go to church every Sunday. I kind of understand you because my mum was also elder, as they would call it, in this particular church, this particular Pentecostal church, and every Friday we would have Bible fellowship. Every Wednesday we would go to church. Every Sunday we would go to church. Every Saturday, she would drag me to evangelism. And at that point, I was about 15 or 16, and I didn't really want to go because I don't know how you felt, but I felt kind of forced into going to church. So in that respect, was there ever a time where growing up you kind of felt resentment towards your family, or in terms of them forcing you to go to church?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say they forced me, but at the same time, it was just taken for granted. So we just had to go to a church service on a Sunday morning. When we were younger, we didn't have to go to the evening church service, which I found deathly boring the 1 or 2 times I went to it.
Yeah.
But as I say, what really made the difference was these young people setting up a youth group. And it was the first time that I'd had an opportunity as a young teenager to be able to listen and ask questions and find out more. And I think that was quite key to me encountering Christ, as well as this person who I could tell she was just so changed, and it was like she had something I did not have, and I was just so intrigued. And that's, as I say, the kind of things that got me going. And then the final thing that happened, interestingly, was not to do with church, but I'd done my O-levels, so I've been working fairly hard, revising and so on, doing the exams.
Yep.
And you'll know this for yourself. When you've worked hard for something like an exam, you can quite often feel a real letdown at the end of it.
Yeah.
If you've done all this effort and suddenly it's all over.
Yeah.
And you haven't got the result, and it's a kind of funny in-between time.
Yep.
I think God used that letdown, that sense of, oh my goodness. And it was almost as though I got a kind of way of seeing that life could be a series of trying to do your hardest and then being let down, trying to do your hardest, and all you do is go on trying to do the next thing, and then you're let down. And I just thought, I don't want to live life like that. I don't want to kind of crash, because I don't know, it kind of made me, I want something that is eternal, I suppose. I don't know I use that word at all, but I wanted something more. And when I read the books, that particularly just ripped my eyes to see that God wanted a relationship with me, that Jesus actually loved me. And one of the best things I have to say about the process was it happened in our back passage. Now, we had a garden at the front of our house, and we had a bit of a strip of a garden down one side, but on the other side it was like a concrete passage. It was really not a nice place, but nobody went there, so you could be on your own. So and it was a nice summer, and I was sitting outside reading the book. The important thing in hindsight was that I made a decision to follow Jesus without anybody influencing me. So it was, I don't know, many people become Christians in meetings and things like that, and that's great. But for me, I think it was very important that I made the decision, and there was no one else influencing me. It was me and God, and it meant that I couldn't blame it on anybody else because I was the only one there doing it. And I think actually it made the commitment much clearer. It wasn't that I kind of, had a massive experience of God or anything like that, but something inside me had changed. I knew something had happened. And then there were a number of steps after that where things started to open up a bit more.
And so you carrying on from when you felt God's presence. If we can go back then and looking at your life now, how do you know that God is with you? Like, can you give examples where?
Okay, so some of it, I think, in the early days of being a Christian, I think I was sensing different things. So, for instance, I think it was some months after I made this commitment, there was a very famous charismatic minister who was visiting the town I lived in. And at that time, it was the time when the charismatic renewal was having a big impact on the Church of England. And we went along to this meeting. My dad didn't want anything to do with it. My mum did. So that was quite interesting in itself. All the young people went, and God definitely touched me in that meeting. But even there, that was just one step on the way. I think very often when you become aware of God, it's in stages and steps. And I think it's really cool that God does it that way, because I think it would be so overwhelming if he did everything in one go.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't want to freak you out. So I'll step forward a little bit just to show you what I mean. I went eventually to college, the university. And near the end of the university time, I was part of a wonderful church. I really, really appreciated it. A whole load of us were going to a Bible week during the summer. And we'd finished college, and there was a prayer meeting at church. I was sitting in this prayer meeting, just any old prayer meeting in a sense, and I suddenly thought I heard God speak to me, like audible words. And I was like, what? What's this? Kind of like, And I thought, I can't tell anybody this. They'll think I'm crazy. So anyway, I was struggling with what I thought I'd heard. And then about 3 days later, we went off to this Bible week. Now, this was something called the Dales Bible Week, which was a very powerful spiritual event that happened over a number of years. But this is the only time I went. And we got there and there was no program. So there were going to be talks in the morning and the evening.
Yep.
So it was 6 days of 2 talks and 1 day with 1 talk. The first day was just an evening talk.
Yeah.
So that was 13 talks by different ministers. And before each of these events, these meetings, I would go into the big tent where everybody met just to be still and to listen to God. And each time I went, I felt God tell me very clearly exactly what that preacher was going to preach on. I had no way of knowing that. There was nothing published. And by the time, the 13th time I'd heard God, and it was right every time, I started to think, okay, God, you can talk, but I'm still going to shut up. I'm not going to tell people because they're still going to think I'm crazy. But I think that was quite a biggie because I don't think God has to speak to you in English language all the time.
No.
But I think there are points where he may speak to you. And I think it was the beginning of a challenge for me to try and listen to God. I mean, really listen to God. And because in a way, if you never expect that someone is going to speak to you, you almost certainly won't hear them when they do.
Yeah.
And I needed to develop the ability to be willing to listen. And sometimes it's not like you hear a voice. Sometimes you just get a sense of God's heart. Sometimes, there's lots of ways God speaks to us and communicates to us. And I think my life has been one of gradually learning these different abilities and, not being stuck on any one of them, just letting God do what God wants to do. But the encouraging thing being that God communicates. And that made an incredible difference to me. Perhaps maybe a bit more of that later.
So before we started this, you said, when you were growing up, you wanted to be in a rock band. Yeah. So, when you finally, decided to follow Jesus and the friends that you wanted to be in a rock band with, did you ever tell them about your faith? And if so, how did they react?
So I did tell them briefly about it. They thought it was strange, although one of them was also a vicar's son as well.
Okay.
But we carried on, that band carried on for another 3 years after I became a Christian. And we were just really close friends, and it was a really special friendship. But I don't think they ever caught anything about that. And I don't think I was very bold in trying to tell them. At the same time, I was still in this youth group and then got involved in starting to play a little bit for worship. And so my musical focus started to broaden from, just playing a rock band to sometimes doing things in church as well.
Okay, so as we all know, we're slowly coming out of a pandemic. And people that are listening to this might say, well, God can't be real, because if God was real, he wouldn't have let this pandemic happen. And if God was real, so many people wouldn't have died during this pandemic. What would you say to people that are a bit skeptical about God and faith and all of that?
It's a good question. Well, I tend to come at it from the point of view that I think the most exciting thing, in a sense, about God and his way of working is that he sent Jesus to the earth, and he sent Jesus to be born and to live on the earth. So his approach in reaching to us was incarnational. It wasn't God speaking from some high place giving commands. And I think I've really come to see across my life that I don't think God you'll have to hear me right on this. I don't think God controls every single thing, because otherwise all we are a robot.
Okay.
If God controlled everything, there is no choice for me to make. And yet, I believe God does give everybody room to make choices. And unfortunately, I think there's been this view that somehow, if God is real, he should control everything. No, he shouldn't.